brain and you get Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. So originally, I was a molecular biologist, and you get a lot of people from diverse backgrounds coming in. I also work on IEEE, on the standards, and particularly the standard for algorithmic bias, and that's P7003. And the section on that I'm looking at is developing stakeholder analysis, and that's identifying all the people who can be impacted by an algorithmic decision, and also how you would audit those algorithms and look at their outcomes. And I'll come back to that later on. Just want to stop 2 seconds before we even look at data and before we even think about how we develop an algorithm. Elena introduced the fact that you're trying to tackle the problems and think about what is the problem that we're trying to tackle and how we're going to solve it. And I think that's a really, really important point. And it's a skill that anybody who goes into machine learning, AI, data science needs to think about first and foremost. You've got to frame the question. You've got to decide what the problem is you're trying to solve. And the two things will be a problem there. If you have non-diverse teams, so if you have, which is the norm within the field, which is why I'm looking at you and you're a very diverse group, which is just spot on, is if you have an all-white, all-male, UK-based team, for example, looking at trying to solve a problem, they will have a very specific worldview and they'll not even think about some things that they could address. So the classic example was when they developed Fitbits. And they developed Fitbits and they thought, we want to sell them to women. So they developed nice Fitbits with nice pink bands and rose gold coverage. And then you look on the health app, and what was missing? Does anybody know what was missing in the original Fitbits health trackers that they were selling to females? What's really obvious that you would need to develop, if a woman wanted to monitor her health and keep track of it, what would a female want to know about?
Was it a period tracker, of course?
Yes, periods. Yeah? So, they'd want to know about their cycles. But of course, the male developers didn't even think about that, so it wasn't there. So when the Fitbits came out, they all said, hang on a minute, this isn't suitable, this is not what we want. So off they went again, and go, all right, we must do stuff to do with periods. So they factored it in so you can map when your periods are and stuff, and then they linked it to fertility, because of course women are worried about getting pregnant, or they want to get pregnant, and that was the viewpoint. Again, what they have forgotten to do, because developers tend to be all young, is that for 50% of a woman's lifetime, she doesn't have periods. So you might have a period between 10 and 50 years old, but after that, you don't have them, and it's not an issue, but you have other health concerns. So again, there was bias indicated in that they just had this very narrow male people. So having diversity in tech, both in terms of gender, ethnicity, and just general classical background, and where you are geographically, you will view problems and developments in a completely different way that would never have got developed before. So again, going way back in time, the first dishwasher was invented by a woman, because men, all the engineers, wouldn't even think about that because they never did the washing in old times. So that type of tech would never be developed. Nowadays, the problems that we have, they couldn't send a female astronaut team up in space just recently because they realised they hadn't developed spacesuits suitable for women. So it's a really obvious thing why you need diversity, which is why we introduced and we created Women Leading in AI, which was to have that diverse and powerful set of voices within the field. Another reason why I co-founded Women Leading in AI is because I noticed that there was very few, because there's few female coders. A lot of the people within the ethics field, and a lot of the females within the ethics field, weren't actually coders themselves. And a lot of the people that were in the field weren't coders. So when a lot of the developers said to them, oh, well, we can't explain our algorithms, they're all a mystery, they fell for it and believed it because they didn't understand how an algorithm was developed. And the focus was very heavily on data. And so having people who understand it go, well, actually, that's not true. there's a whole range of development processes as a data scientist when you're developing an algorithm. So let's just say it's a prediction algorithm for classifying whether you have skin cancer or not. You know, an example of that. Or you're going to decide to put somebody in prison because they're a violent offender and likely to reoffend, or you think they're actually not going to reoffend and they're non-violent, and you can actually put them in a community order. So that's a classic example. So if you were developing that algorithm and it was found to be biased, and there's some very famous examples such as the Compass algorithm that was found to be biased, they will say, well, we can't explain it, we can't make that decision. But that's actually not true, because there's a whole load of decision-making processes, as well as framing the question, and the priorities you put on the question, it's where you get your data from. So an example would be, if I was to design, we'll stick with the Compass idea. If I wanted to make sure that I was going to put people in the right thing, in the community order, whether they have to go and do community service or in prison, and I want to ask that question, I then have to think about, well, I've got to make sure, where do I get my data set from? So where would you go get your data set from to design that algorithm? Sentencing records, people's criminal records. Where would the bias be in that? Why might that data set be biased? Just the data set itself. What's one of the problems that we have within society? Where we collect this data within society, what do the police tend to focus on? Black communities, yes? Over and above white communities, there is an inbuilt bias within that, where we tend to collect the data from a particular type of community. Another example would be childcare, child abuse and child neglect. So there was an algorithm developed for child welfare, and they took the data from all previous reported incidences and developed, looked at all the features of what type of family would be most likely to abuse or neglect their children, and what children and their characteristics were most likely to suffer from neglect and abuse. And they collected all that data and they designed this algorithm to predict who should have a home visit and be investigated, and who probably was okay just to sort of keep an eye on, or to say, no, there's not an issue. These are real algorithms that are being used, and about 5 or 6 councils within the UK now have instituted these. And they will say to you that they're not biased because they've tested them. So there's no racial inequality in there whatsoever. What they are ignoring in determining how they design that algorithm is that people are 350% more likely to report black and biracial families than white families, even though there is no evidence that being black or biracial means you're more likely to neglect or abuse your children. But because of unconscious bias within people, so not deliberate, but there can also be deliberate prejudice, people see one type of behaviour in a group and see that as negative. They could see a similar type of behaviour in another group and think and excuse that way in a different manner. And a classic example of that was to show how they tested this about unconscious bias by developing a shooting game where they had identical robots in humanoid form, but some were coloured white and some were coloured black. And what they found was the robots didn't behave in any other different way, just the colour was different. People shot the black robots more frequently than they shot the white robots, because they felt that the behaviour of that black robot, because of unconscious bias and systemic racism that has come back for many years, is that they found that behaviour more threatening and they were more likely to be at risk from the black robot, so they shot them more. So when you see that type of behaviour, that is what's reported. And this is the type of data that we are constantly collecting over decades and decades and decades, which we are collecting now from police records, from child welfare records, from school records, all over. And that's the data that we're using to make these prediction algorithms. So you can see automatically how that can be biased. So even with the best will in the world, the original people who developed the first childware algorithm, what they did is they instigated what I call mitigation strategies. So it says, right, well, what we'll make sure is we will only ever report, we'll try and balance out the algorithm, so we report about 50% only of all white families and 50% of all black families. So it's not a biased algorithm. It ignores the fact that you might only have 10 families being reported who are white, and so you investigate 50% of that family, so that's only 5. But 35 families, or let's round up, 40 families of black and biracial families will be reported, but we're only going to investigate 50% of those, but 20 are being investigated. So you have 5 white families versus 20 black families being investigated. So an algorithm developer will say, we've tested our algorithm for bias and for fairness, and we say that we only ever investigate 50% of all groups, no matter what their race. But when you look at the raw figures, actually, you're 4 times more likely to be investigated if you are black or biracial, as opposed to whether you were white. So they would then say, well, that's a biased algorithm. And this is where a lot of the debate within the ethics community has happened now. And this is what kicked off with Compass, which was what's called a recidivism algorithm, where they were using this to sentence people into prison or not. And they found, ProPublica did an investigation and said, this is biased. If you were a black male, you are more likely to be put into prison. And if you are a white male, you're more likely to be released. And they found it was biased. The company who developed it says no, because in the way that we tested bias is actually fair. So we, even within the ethics community, argue about how we test for fairness. So you, doing data science today, when you think about data, you really need to know the statistics, and you really need to think about those questions. And you also need to think about something called unintended consequences. Because even if you think you have developed your algorithm to be as fair as you possibly can, set your thresholds at the end point. So you might select your data, you might collect your data, clean it up, pre-process it. You might have your features. Well, what features do I use? So you might have even taken out all the features that said, for example, their race. So you don't have it linked as black in your data set, or white, you don't have any of that information, so you think you've debiased your data set. But there's things like in there that are, for example, biased by proxy. So an example would be where you live, so your postcode. Because communities tend to live together, certain communities will have more possibly people who are convicted of crime within that community, because there's more police focusing on that crime, because the type of crime they focus on is considered more important to think about. So there's all bias in these decisions. So actually they're still testing you if you are by race. So you have these features by proxy that can also still account for that. But even if you deal with all of that, and you can weight them differently. So you might decide that a feature is more important than another feature. So you might have, you're deciding on your car insurance algorithm to determine your car. So you may decide that people who drive Fiat 500s are more risky than people who drive think of a big car, I don't know cars really well, a giant Jeep, for example, okay? Now, think about who might drive a Fiat 500, and think about who might drive a great big, Jeep, okay? So even if they take gender out, it might be that just because of the type of car you drive, you might have a gender bias within there as well. And that exists within loan payments. And they'll even have things in their loan payments where if you're a cat owner as opposed to a dog owner, and there's all bias in there. So you might set your thresholds and your classification accuracy there, but even beyond the algorithm, even beyond that, there's what's called unintended consequences, where there's whole groups you might not see and have long-term consequences for your algorithm, even if you made it unbiased. And a good example, just coming out now, this is your age group. I hope you don't use Tinder, right? Okay, but if you use Tinder, and it's become very popular now, they're finding that the impact of these apps are having a change within society on people's ability to carry out long-term relationships. And so we're starting to see this data come through that they're actually changing society. We can't prove directly, and again, this is another data science thing that's really important. You can't prove causation. You can only show correlation, that there seems to be a relationship between these two trends. And so when you are developing these things in ethics, you need to look at the wider remit of the impact of that algorithm and who it can impact on. And I'm keeping an eye on the time. So that is a classic example. So the type of identifying the problem, identifying where you get that data from, thinking about how you process that data, and what features you include, and what weight you put on those features before you even send it through the algorithm, and then how you process that afterwards and set your thresholds. Like, is it more important to get as many violent offenders into prison, even if that risks putting an innocent person in prison, or somebody who wouldn't reoffend in prison when they shouldn't be? Or is it better to keep all the good people, the innocent people, the people who won't reoffend, out in the community, even if that means risking releasing some violent offenders when you don't want to? So where do you make that decision as to what is the most important thing to set your threshold at, and how will that affect your accuracy? And that's what's called post-processing, or exploratory analysis after you've got your results. This is the things that you do. And it's a human decision-making process that you make. So as a data scientist, or somebody who's developing machine learning algorithms, there's an awful lot of philosophy, an awful lot of psychology, an awful lot of social science involved thinking about these things. And when you have non-diverse teams, sometimes you don't even think about the problems. And I will close so you can ask me questions with two things. One is the example, I could give you so many examples where there's bias, but the classic one was, did you ever see the YouTube video where they found this hand dryer that when you put your hand under it, it turns it on? And what they found, some black men came in and they tried it and it wasn't working for them. And they saw a white man come in and he put his hand underneath it and it worked fine for them, and they sort of thought, what's going on here? So we'll try again. It didn't work for them. So this is really weird. Is it because we're black? And so they got a white piece of paper. So it wasn't in the hand shape. So white people put it under the dryer, turned on, started drying. It didn't recognise their skin. And this is a big issue because we have some skin care and skin cancer recognition apps that come on that will developed mainly in the UK. So let's have some we have in the UK, and we're looking at all of these types of moles, and we're sort of doing image recognition on them and determining if that mole is likely to be skin cancer or not. And they're really accurate and they're really, really good. But the accuracy is reduced if you have black skin, because the data set doesn't have that very many examples of cancerous moles on black skin. So if, for example, the NHS goes, right, this is brilliant, we're just going to use this now, and we can just identify and diagnose all skin cancers using this app, and this is great, it'll save so much time, what you're going to get is you're going to get increase, even if it's not statistically significant, you will get an increase in misdiagnosis of people from ethnic communities for that reason. And you start in building bias and discrimination within the system then. And it's very hard to prove. And again, this is why the ethicists now and all the standard setting that you heard from Alejandro is so important, because we're flagging this stuff and trying to put systems in place that people can follow, and why people like me and Ivana, who you will hear from, are doing organisations like Women Leading in AI to actually really address this, to try and get diverse teams developing it, so we can identify the problems and we can consider the bias within the system, and we can consider the unintended consequences as well. So, and I do recommend you follow the work of Joy Bull and Winnie, who did Gender Shades when she spotted facial recognition was very bad, particularly for black females, and the AI Now Institute, and they're doing some fantastic work in New York.